Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Trafford, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
Ted, how are you, sir?
Liam, doing wonderful. How about you?
Do you know what? I am incredible, and I'll tell you why.
Okay, I can't wait.
I've been doing feasibility all week.
One of my favorite topics. I can't wait to hear how it's been going.
Well, I decided to. I was inspired by you and your writing and how you often communicate things, and I thought I'll try and add a TED element here and
All right.
try and get a bit of humor and characters almost involved in this sort of like description of my realizations, shall we say?
I can't wait.
Yeah,
This is going to be good.
And I'm grayer as a result of
are you?
feasibility. Yeah, it's always good fun, isn't it? It's always good fun.
Oh, it's so challenging. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Yeah, doing it well
yeah,
is hard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I do want to talk about feasibility, and I've got a few notes and things to talk through, but feel free to jump in at any point. So I think that I think listeners are probably already started to feel that. I think what's interesting is that feasibility. It sounds like the part of the trial where everyone becomes like a PDF. So, we're going to real focus on one particular slice of that PDF at the minute, which is the feasibility of actually delivering the required patients. And we're not talking about can you find them on paper, or we're not talking about can you list some of the sites that can find them. We're actually I'm talking about like the real humans that get through the real process and then get randomized. Because ultimately, for me, this is really the main principle of it, right? Is that we do feasibility not to address how many patients there are, but it's about how many you can randomize. So I'm going to introduce a few characters who will show up in the feasibility process. Okay, so we've got character one, who is Spreadsheet Larry. So Spreadsheet Larry walks into the room and he's wearing a suit made of conditional formatting in Excel. Larry loves his numbers. Larry will say, "Good news, feasibility says there's 12,000 patients," and everyone relaxes. Those numbers feel like safety and the numbers feel like truth. But there's obviously a problem here, is that a patient that exists is not a patient that you can enroll. And a patient you can enroll is not a patient that you can randomize. So feasibility for me is not necessarily, it isn't a head count. It's actually a conversion system. It's about the funnel. And the only number that ultimately matters is at the end is the randomized, right? So, I think that what I see a lot of the time is that, it's the truth that annoys everyone, but it does, I think, save trials, which is, even the best feasibility is inaccurate. It always is, right? So we can't reason from these are the numbers and we feel completely certain in those numbers. The goal in the process isn't actually certainty. The goal is usefulness. Yep. So feasibility becomes more of a forecast, not a fact. So the question I always ask people is that it's more about how wrong we are, and do we understand the mechanism well enough to correct quickly. That is important, because we're going to go completely off the numbers, right? And it's just a quantum. Are we 5% wrong, or are we 50% wrong? But we have
to, and what factors?
Exactly.
Yeah, and what factors do most influence those numbers?
Exactly, which we'll actually come to at the end. So there's a couple of traps that we can obviously fall into as we're working through this, as it relates to sort of patient delivery. Is that So I've got the EMR Oracle. This is basically
Okay.
false confidence in a lab coat. So this is character 2. So it's the EMR or EHR Oracle faintly, and she speaks in diagnosis codes. So she'll say something like, the EMR contains 10,000 patients with your condition, and the room goes quiet because it feels official. But the EMR data is basically what it's doing, I believe at least, is that it's giving psychological safety and a false confidence because healthcare records weren't built to answer research questions. That they're built as, and going to the first principles, is they're built for care delivery, documentation, workflow, and billing. They're messy, labels drift, old diagnoses haunt problem lists.
Mhm.
It's the nuance that can be buried within the notes. So, like, my rule of thumb when you're starting to deal with some of these EMR data is that you need to recognize that it's about being roughly right rather than precisely wrong. So the EMR is input. You need to triangulate around other things like clinical reality checks, pathway logic, small validation samples, selective charts reviews, and so on and so forth, because really the data is only the start of the conversation. It's not the end of it.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah, I love asking physicians the question, how many, like, think back to this week or the last 2 weeks, and how many patients did you see
Yeah.
that realistically might have been potential candidates for a trial? Because that's fresh in their mind. And they can think back, wow, yeah, I saw probably 10 people with this condition, but out of that,
Yeah.
most of them, is just a quick
Yeah.
script I wrote, and they had drug coverage. So yeah, 9 of them wouldn't have been candidates. And I think
Absolutely.
that tells maybe a lot more than, oh, I've got 10,000
Yeah.
people in the EMR with this condition.
I love that. Yeah, as like a proxy to sort of like level up, because then at least you can then start to say, because I think it's a really good point, isn't it? Because it's like, again, to the numbers, is that if you've got individuals that are coming in to to clinic, is that they are having a relationship with their healthcare provider, and that builds trust.
Mhm.
Now, it may be a case of, like you say, one, and then you can say, actually, we can sort of like forecast this out and saying roughly you're looking at one patient per week, best case scenario. Um, and the reality is that if those patients have been in to clinic, and then you have been able to have that conversation, you are probably more likely to entice them, rather than not entice them, but to tell them about the trial. And the reality is that that's very different than sending a text message or a letter to their house to say, hey, do you want to take part in research? Which is very different, because one of them is like a transaction, and the other one should really be about relationship and care and more depth in that interaction when patients come in.
Yeah, the other hard part about it is that it has to be indication specific as far as the understanding of the condition.
Yeah.
So one example is there's certain conditions that physicians may have a lot of patients in their practice with that condition,
Yeah.
but they're all treated.
Yes. Yes.
And what you're looking for in that case is actually the new referrals they get.
Yeah.
And so it's not the people that's in their EMR with that condition,
Mhm.
because they're not going to be candidates for the trial. It's going to be,
Exactly.
how often do they get a new referral
Yes.
for somebody with that condition?
Absolutely. Yeah. And those sort of like interception pathways, to be able to model those out, because that becomes the real. And like you say, is that there's the patient profile, and then there's like subcategorizing that around things like, well, what are we competing against? And everyone says about, oh, it's you're competing against other clinical trials. Well, the reality is you're actually competing against healthcare and what's already out there, right? So that's a bigger competition and a bigger threat to your actual feasibility and delivery than another trial that's being, done down the road or even in the same unit.
Yep.
So yeah, and there's, I think that the other one that is really interesting is I heard actually this not long ago, is that I'm calling him Prevalence Pete. So
Okay.
Pete shows up with the headline, this area, this region has 10% prevalence, we must go there. But prevalence without population is just a percentage, floating in space. You've got, as an example, you could have 20,000 people in an area with a 10% prevalence rate, and you say, okay, well, that's 2,000 people that we could access. And you say, okay, well, prevalence is really critical, but actually you've got an area B where you've got 3 million people at 5% prevalence rate, and there's 150,000 people. So really, feasibility doesn't care about the sexiest percentage; it cares about the biggest addressable denominator. That I think sometimes again gets lost. I had spoke with a group not long ago who was like, "Oh, we must go and partner with this particular group because around their area they have a percentage of whatever it was, 8% or something." And you looked at the area and you were like, "Well, actually, there's only like 10,000 people in there. It doesn't really make sense just from mathematical perspective."
Yeah, but it's also even more nuanced than that. So in your example with, the city with 3 million people and the prevalence of 5%,
Yeah.
that's not the true access for a physical site operating in that city. That site in that city may have a much more confined catchment area because people won't travel that far.
Exactly.
Because of traffic or whatever.
Exactly.
And so their catchment area may be much smaller.
Yes. Yeah.
So it gets really complex.
Absolutely. And yeah, so those are the factors then, like you say, that we need to take into consideration all these guys. And it's a really well made point, Ted, because the reality in one instance is that, like you say, that catchment area for the area A at 10% with 2,000 people, they could cover all those 2,000 people, whereas the catchment area for
that's right.
The city may only actually be 5%, and therefore it's set, it's 750 people or something like that. So that's definitely a good point. Well made.
Yeah. Yeah. And if the site is the only site around, they may have really good relationships.
Yeah.
With the community, their patients. So that's another factor.
Absolutely. And those relationships are absolutely critical in my mind, because it's trust, right? And that's, we don't, which we'll get into that, actually it might be worth going there, like, is that it's actually, I've got Motivation Mabel. So,
okay.
So I'm going to introduce it. So she quietly destroys feasibility models while Larry is still polishing his spreadsheet. And,
okay.
So she's Mabel is the patient who technically qualifies, but simply isn't interested. So she'll say things like, "I don't trust this. I feel fine enough. My partner isn't comfortable," and so on and so forth. And this is the point that is really critical, because just because we think we know where patients are doesn't mean that they'll want to take part, or more like eligibility is a necessity, and a patient in a database is not a patient. You need to have a reason, and we don't qualify those reasons. We just see digits, ones and twos, right? Oh, patient here exists, but we can't actually get under the hood. And that ultimately, because most feasibility models pretend patients are like atoms, if they exist and meet criteria, they'll participate in some capacity. We obviously apply conversion rates and so on and so forth, but patients are fundamentally humans, and humans run on motivation, trust, fear, hope, friction, convenience, perceived value. So like, recruitment is really a value exchange, not a data exercise. And that can really, there's really a hidden tax in every funnel, which is that motivation. So it's really important to get, conversations with the patients before actually diving into and signing off those data points for your feasibility.
Understanding the why is really important.
So important. one more, and then I'll sort of like pull it together a little bit. So the other one which I ran into quite recently was it's character 4, which is we're going to call a subtype Sally. So this is the moment research needs detail that healthcare never stored neatly. So for instance, like IBS is a good example. So IBS may be coded, but the actual subtypes often aren't. And that's because ultimately
Correct.
healthcare and research are optimized for completely different outcomes, right? So like the coding is not eligibility in a lot of conditions that have these subtypes because you simply don't have the information to be able to reason from. So that's hence the reason why we have to go as an example. Okay, well, how many patients do have IBS? And then of that, what is the percentage that then fall into one of these or two of these or three of these categories that fall underneath it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important, and often then you're relying on again, going back to the investigator's memory.
Yes.
And saying, can you estimate for us,
Yeah.
what percentage of your population of IBS patients are, constipation
Yes.
predominant or diarrhea predominant?
Exactly.
So, yep.
And also, can you do it without any drivers of motivations to win this study? So can you be as honest as you possibly can? So there's like a couple of variables in there that you can't. You hence the reason why we discount the number of patients, right? Patients that sites can deliver, which is just wild. Right. So I mean, for me, sort of tying there's a few other ones, but I won't go into detail with them. But I think what's really interesting is that, and it's something that you mentioned at the start, is that I think that you have to almost build. It's not one feasibility, right? You need different scenarios. So you need like whether it's in conservative, base, and best case scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Me is that you plan for those base case scenarios, but you then look to strategize and work to the best case. There's things that you simply can't control. So, for instance, prevalence is an example, but there's a lot of things that you can control in that process to improve conversion rates. Things like like you say, the why participate. Any trust signals that we can build in. How do we reduce burden for the patients? How do we support the patient more, whether that's like travel reminders, human contact? How do we like essentially remove the friction from those people? So I think that like there's a real like art but science to it. Is that the science is what's out there, but the art's really around how do we get humans to move through the system. So I think that like ultimately the smell test is that if feasibility is basically like a patient count, it's not really feasibility. It's like optimism wearing a lab coat. And we really need to be in a position that real feasibility should be pretty dynamic. We should understand how confident we are at the data. A great question for me asking people is like, okay, you show me this data, how confident are you in it? And it's really wild because people will say, oh, well, I'm 100% confident, but actually a lot of the data is not right. It's like, well, okay, so you're confident in the data, but how confident are you in the prediction of that data? And it's like, oh, well, actually about 60%. And it's just such a simple question, I think, to ask to actually get to the root of the person who's providing the data to then what your confidence should be of it. Which I think is absolutely critical. And we need to look at things like what the conversion of the funnel really looks like, and what is driving people from motivation and things like that. So because ultimately the goal of feasibility is not to be right, it's to be useful. Because ultimately feasibility isn't how many patients are out there, it's how many will go into the trial, and then what are the things that we can do to control that to make it real. I think is the critical bit. Anyway,
yeah, that's really interesting, Liam. It's such a complex process.
It really is.
And I think to your point that when we try and reduce it to a spreadsheet, which is how a lot of sponsors make decisions, it's not taking into consideration a lot of the things that would actually identify sites that can perform well in clinical trials.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you for your time.
Amazing.
And listen to me waffle.
No, this was fascinating. It gave me a lot to think about. I'm constantly, commenting how feasibility is broken and how we need to work to improve it. And you've given us a lot to think about today. So appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Appreciate you. Speak soon.
You too. Yeah. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.